everybody, and welcome. I want to show you today how to create this succulent flower cake. This is the first time I have ever done anything like this, and it's not perfect, but I'm pretty proud with how it turned out. So I will show you step by step how I put it together, how I created it, and if you haven't liked, followed, or subscribed, please do so, and let's get started. Okay, so I'll begin by taking my flower nail, cut up pieces of parchment paper, and my offset spatula, and I will take just a little bit of icing and place it right on my flower nail to attach the parchment paper and keep it from moving. And once each flower is done, I can just slide the flowers off and stick them in the freezer. And I'll begin with my darkest shade of green and tip number 199, which is like an open star tip, and begin by piping a nice dollop of icing, and it doesn't have to be perfect because this is just the base. So I will start from the base and pipe straight up and go side by side, making sure to avoid any gaps, and just continue all the way around. And as I get to the side where I've piped before, I will just continue to pipe straight up, overlapping the lines. Just going to make sure that all the gaps are filled in and really try to round that cactus out. Next, I will take my Dusty Rose and tip number 30 and create just a small flower right on top. And next I will take my white and tip number 2, which is just a really small circle tip, and just pipe little dots on each of the strips of the cactus. And these are just the spokes of a cactus. And I will just continue to pipe these spokes all the way around. And right now the cactus is out of camera shot, but about halfway around the cactus I had to slide it off because my icing was starting to get soft, and so I wanted to make sure that I didn't ruin my cactus. So I finished piping the spokes and placed it in the freezer. Now I will begin to pipe another cactus, so another dollop, and start piping lines side by side. And I really want to make sure that the top is flat, so I just pipe it up and push down, really round that top out, creating the cactus look, making sure to fill in my gaps. And then I will take that rose and pipe on a flower. And then I'll take my white again and start piping on the spokes. And now you can see how I just pipe a few on each strip. They're just little dots. And this was actually pretty challenging because I'm used to piping with 2 hands, and so holding the flower with one hand and piping with the other was kind of challenging. However, the cactus was the easiest flower to create. It was pretty painless, and I had a lot of fun making these. as I finish, I will slide it off and place it in the freezer. Next, I will take my darkest green and dusty rose and tip number 80, which is a crescent shape, and begin to pipe in the middle, push down, and gently release up. And this was the hardest flower to create. And I actually had created another one before, but it was a disaster, so I did not use that one. So this is my second attempt. And I just had to be really, really gentle with my motions, making sure not to stretch each petal out too far, otherwise it would fall, especially when working with softer icing, because by this point my icing had been worked with so much, so it just was harder to work with. But as long as I kept those smaller motions, then it actually went pretty well. But I just keep building on top of each layer, really making sure to keep my tip facing up and filling in gaps, and there we go. Next, I will take my lightest shade of green and tip number 16, which is a closed start tip, and just placing more parchment paper on my flower nail. And I'll begin from the center and pull straight out, gently releasing. And I keep it flat for my base and start building as I go around. And as I start building, I'll start to pull up to really create that spiky look like desert plants have. And just keep building up and going up to the center, and I'll start going around the sides and filling in gaps and really trying to add more dimension with pulling up instead of laying flat. And there we go. Next, I will take my tan and light green and tip number 103 and place another piece of parchment, and now I will begin creating a desert rose. And I actually did not end up using this particular rose because I created another one just like it. However, I had flipped the tip upside down with the fattest part facing upwards. Right now I have the smallest end facing upwards, and I just created a small bud, and now I'm piping in an upwards U and just really overlapping each petal, taking my time, working my way around. And like I said, the other rose I created that I actually used has thicker petals because I used the fatter side facing upwards. But it's the exact same as this rose. And just continue to work my way around, building on top of each petal. And then when I'm satisfied with how my rose is looking, then I will stop. And that's it. So next I will take my 8-inch cake board, my offset spatula, my bench scraper, and 2 6-inch cakes. And I will begin by taking my offset spatula and placing just a little bit of icing right on my cake board. This is meant to keep the cake on the cake board, keep it from sliding around. And then I will take my cake and I had my cakes already baked ahead of time and had frozen them, so I had to unwrap them, and I will just place my first layer right on the center of my cake board. Okay. And you always want to make sure that your cakes are leveled out and flat on top. So now I will begin by taking my offset spatula and placing a generous amount of icing right on my cake. And I will begin by starting in the center and working my way to the edges, making sure to never touch the cake, only the icing. This is to make sure that I don't pick up any crumbs or destroy the cake. And I'll just keep smoothing it as I work my way to the edges. And I decided to not do a white icing for the filling and the outside of the cake. I decided to do the same tan as in my desert rose. And this is because these are desert flowers, so I wanted to create a deserty look. So now I keep pushing the icing to the edge, really making sure that it stays smooth. And I'm adding just a little bit more icing because I have thicker layers. And some people do cut their layers in half. However, I like to keep just my layers just how they are and do 2 layers of cake. And now I am going to take my other layer of cake and put the top side down with the bottom side up to make sure that I have that flat top, and place it right on top of the bottom layer, making sure that the sides are straight. And here I have to adjust my camera. So I am going for a naked cake look, and the naked cake look is basically just a crumb coat, which means it's a very light layer of icing. And typically, if you are just going to do a normal coating of icing, you start with a crumb coat, and I typically throw mine in the freezer for 10 to 15 minutes and then build my icing from there. But since I am doing just a naked look, I don't need to worry about the second step. So I am just placing a generous amount of icing on top because I'm going to really work it down the sides. But I begin by starting in the center again and working the icing to the edges. And it's always better to have too much icing than not enough because you can always take it away. Making sure that my sides are even and straight, and just work the icing over the edge. Scraping my offset spatula so that way I don't have a bunch of excess of icing. And now I'm going to take some icing and start filling in the gaps on the side and dragging those edges down. And just smoothing it out. Keep filling in the gaps and smoothing it out. And like I said, I would rather put too much icing than not enough because you can always take icing away. Okay, and I just keep filling in the gaps, and then I'll begin to smooth the sides and get the excess icing off. And just scrape my spatula. And I want to make sure that I am exposing some of the cake to go for that naked cake look. And since I'm going for a desert look, I wasn't too worried if my sides were completely smooth. If there was a couple of small gaps that weren't major, I didn't see it as a big deal just because it is a deserty look. It's very rustic and more rough. So now I'm going to take my bench scraper and just smooth out the sides and make sure that they're straight. And just scraping it off as I build up icing. Okay. And then I will take my offset spatula and just fill in some of the bigger gaps. I will go back with my bench scraper and smooth those sides out again. Okay, and when I'm satisfied with my sides, then I will take my offset spatula and start dragging the edges in, keeping my offset spatula nice and flat, making sure that my edges are smooth, and I'm smoothing the top of my cake as well. Oh, there's my sun. And I will continue all the way around. And just make sure that the top of my cake is smooth. And next I will take my icing and tip number 12 and just start piping on little dollops of icing to start attaching my flowers. And I just decided to do a random placement of my flowers, trying to make sure that I didn't place two of the same flowers next to each other, and making sure I try to squeeze them down as best as possible, but I will go in later and try to fill in my gaps. Okay, and now I'm going to place a flower right in the middle and start filling in the gaps. Placing flowers closer to the edge as well. It doesn't matter if they kind of hang over. having fun with it. Next, I'm going to take my medium shade of green and tip number 32, which is like a closed star tip almost, and just piping dollops to fill in the gaps and to create more dimension. Just going around, randomly placing little dollops of icing. Next, I'm going to switch my tip out for tip number 7, which is just a flat circle tip, and this just creates smooth dollops rather than the rigid edges. Just to create different textures within the cake. Filling in those gaps. And I also forgot to mention, I did chill my cake before I placed the flowers on. So in between, I just chilled the cake for 10 to 15 minutes to kind of get that icing to set. And I decided right about here that I really liked the look of the rigid edges on the other dollops, so I ended up changing the tip back to the 32. And I'll just go in and continue to fill in gaps, and adding some dollops in places where I thought that they needed to go. And I wasn't too worried about the back of the cake with filling in gaps. Just because it was the back of the cake, I was really more focused around the sides and the front. And the middle as well. And when I am satisfied with it, I'll just take a quick look at it, and it is complete. And there we have it. And that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed.